You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property and their laws. They had no part in making.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Ansel.
This is episode 345 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. Marko Marjanovic joins me on today's show. The show can be found at the Libertarian Institute. The show's featured on the homepage alongside my daily news roundup. Make sure you subscribe to the show somewhere. It's on all the podcatchers, YouTube, and please enjoy the interview. Joining me on today's episode of the show is Marko Marjanovic, who runs the Checkpoint Asia website, a great news source for monitoring the U.S. empire. In fact, if you all go to that site, there's going to be a little pop-up there that says, sign up for delicious empire hatred, which I know is something that's going to appeal to my very libertarian audience. So if I go to the website, check it out, and when it says sign up for empire hatred, I mean, I don't know how you can't do that. So, Marko, welcome back to the show. I think it's been a little bit over 100 episodes now since I've had you on.
Well, it sounds like you've been very productive, and I'm glad to be on.
Well, you've certainly been productive, too. If people go to the Checkpoint Asia website, I mean, there's going to be new content there every day, pretty much, and usually several articles I see. So it's definitely something worth checking out, bookmarking, and making sure you're paying attention to. Just on today's show, I think we're going to try to do a little bit more of a roundtable format. I'm going to try not to dominate with questions and controlling the flow of the conversation here the best I can. And we want to start off today with Venezuela and kind of the ongoing coup, regime change, whatever's going on there. I mean, if you talk to different people, everybody has a different interpretation, whether this is a popular driven movement among the Venezuelan people to finally get rid of their terrible communist dictator Maduro, to people who say this is simply a U.S.-backed coup effort where you have this guy who definitely attended some college in the United States, being more or less a CIA asset and, well, you know, now orchestrating a coup in Venezuela and trying to overthrow Maduro. And I mean, we've had the U.S. Bolton kind of saying that, hey, the plan here is to get the oil. And so I guess you go one way or the other on it. I don't know, Marko, kind of give me your feel here. Do you think this is how much U.S. backing does this coup effort have?
I mean, how much? Maybe you actually have the president encouraging it on Twitter, you know, and like the entire White House, you know, like kind of try and be there for Guaido, you know, like get the people riled up, you know. It's like they're taking an active part, you know. It's not even covered or anything, you know. I mean, it is cringy, you know, because like what Venezuelans are gonna rise up because Mike Pence said, you know, something in Spanish, you know, but you know, they are definitely trying.
Right. Well, I do think within the U.S. politics, there's a lot of interesting stuff going on, too, now. I've kind of learned that there's actually a quite substantial Venezuelan population in Florida, which a key swing state in the United States. And, maybe that's part of it. Marco Rubio is certainly one of the loudest kind of neocon establishment voices on this whole thing. Big regime change pusher. So I find that to be a pretty interesting angle too. And I think that's something that Trump could be kind of easily sold on. Hey, Mr. President, you need to win Florida. This is a way to get the state there is to get the Venezuelan people on board with you.
For Trump personally, I think it's very clear that, you know, domestic politics is really 98% of everything he cares about, you know. He just wants to get reelected. But you know, for the rest of them, this is really a crusade. I mean, Bolton doesn't care about Trump as such. You know, Trump is just a vehicle for him.
Yeah, well, I mean, certainly, Abrams, the U.S. envoy to Venezuela, John Bolton, Pompeo, Rick Scott, Marco Rubio, all seem to be, you know, real diehard believers in this, which is the worrying part to me because, you know, as we've progressed here and we had the original kind of, what was that, coup attempt on the 23rd of, I think, January, all the way to this, new one now where they're going to have the military. And I think, if you read the Moon of Alabama blog, it seems like the Guaido faction got snookered a little bit, thinking that the Supreme Court justice, the defense minister, and the National Guard director were all going to switch to his side, and they didn't end up doing that. So, another failed coup attempt, right here at the end of April. What direction can they go from here? It would seem to me that after like 2 failed coup attempts, Guaido has to be kind of like, burnt out on them and would have to leave the country, or, they had to pick a new figurehead to lead this thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I have one question for you, Carl. Why is he still walking around as a free man? Is it because, he's become such a joke? He's actually more valuable to Maduro, being on the outside, making a joke out of himself, instead of being, locked up?
Well, I certainly think it goes to show that Maduro doesn't see him as enough of a threat. That the bigger downside would be to arrest him and have all the international pressure, because, John Bolton's going to react and say, if they don't release him immediately, then the U.S. is going to take all appropriate action to do so. And there's going to be a lot of threats and sanctions coming from the U.S. But if he's not a threat and just some crazy guy walking around the country saying, I'm the president, when he's clearly not, because every time he declares himself president, more people go out and stand in front of the presidential palace and say, no, Maduro's our president. So it doesn't seem to be hurting Maduro at all. His poll numbers have gone up since this whole thing started off and the U.S. has introduced sanctions. So I'm guessing that there's just not enough of a downside for Maduro to arrest him, which goes to show the lack of, legitimacy of, Guaido's claim here.
Yeah, and, one of the claims is also that Maduro is this, huge tyrant, who is starving his people. But, I mean, what would happen in America, if a dude walked around streets of Washington, D.C., and he had 15 National Guardsmen behind him, all carrying automatic rifles, and they had a machine gun with them, and they sort of set up a machine gun position on a highway overpass, and kind of stood around there, and then, called the military, and said, this isn't just, us, bearing arms. This is our uprising against the government, and we call on the rest of the military to join us. Where would such a guy be in America, after that?
Well, and I mean, to the extent that something like this has happened recently, look at, the Oregon standoff where you had some more right-wing militia types, not even like declaring an overthrow to the government or anything, but just, protesting with armed weapons. The U.S. government went and surrounded them, shot a couple of them, and didn't tolerate it whatsoever. So, obviously we know how the U.S. government reacts when somebody armed goes and defies the government, even not saying that we're in open opposition and we're looking to overthrow the president. I guess one thing you kind of bring up there is that this idea that Maduro is terrible to his own people and the Venezuelan people are really suffering. And this is something that, as a libertarian, I bought into kind of early on now. It's been a couple of years since I really didn't understand that, the U.S. is a world empire and that, we're the ones pushing policy. And I think largely not largely, but in major part responsible for the Venezuelan people being so poor. But that's a really powerful narrative, especially for Americans, because a lot of people see themselves as the great liberators around here. And that if, the Trump administration could say that, hey, all the people in Venezuela are suffering, so we have to go liberate them. All the same people who bought into Iraq are going to do the same thing again for that reason.
Yeah, and I actually read something yesterday, which actually explained that, kind of like really heavy and serious U.S. sanctions didn't start until this year and until late 2018. So it does look like, Maduro kind of ruined the economy there, mainly on his own. But I mean, now that there are sanctions in place, it's going to be very hard to improve it, even though, I presume so. They've changed, some of the policies. They've definitely stabilized the situation. And also, look, Max Blumenthal traveled to there, he brought back, a lot of footage, and, it looks like a normal country, like, there's shopping malls and everything, so yeah, I mean, the way he put it is, look, this is an economic crisis, but it's not a humanitarian crisis. So, I mean, it's really unfortunate, that you end up with a government that, kind of ruins your economy. But I mean, if we're going to start opposing every government, that ruins an economy, really? I mean, what if the Chinese showed up, in America, because Bush inflated a bubble, and there was a huge crisis in 2008,
Right. I mean, there certainly are Americans who are suffering because of a lack of wealth. I'm guessing that the problem in Venezuela is a little bit worse. They were an oil economy, and, a way that the U.S. was really able to pat the Venezuelan economy, even prior to the sanctions being put in place, is just being the world empire. Our countries get, I think, better deals with Venezuela than otherwise would have, to buy their oil. And also, we see in the past that the U.S. was intentionally trying to move the world oil price to harm the Venezuelan and Iranian economies. So, there's a lot of things going on here other than just the sanctions. But if you want to look at like places in the world where people are suffering, I mean, number one has to be Yemen, and 2 and 3 are probably Somalia and Libya, all places where the U.S. is taking active action to make the situation worse for the civilian population. And so, I'm sure you see this too and get so frustrated that there's really so much hypocrisy here with this whole, responsibility to protect doctrine. I don't know. I'll let you take a shot at that doctrine if you want.
Look, yeah, what you said, suffering and all that, and it was really, difficult to watch Pompeo, saying like, we cannot tolerate this anymore, like children not having medicine, what do Cubans and the Russians think they're doing, I mean, really, Pompeo, I mean, you just pass sanctions on Venezuela, that's going to make it, very hard for them to get out of the crisis, and you're contributing to Yemen, where there's been 250,000 deaths, and you're going to lecture to Cubans, who are themselves under, really heavy sanctions. And what you say, yeah, I mean, for sure, economically, Venezuela, right now has it worse than the U.S. did after 2008. Absolutely. But I mean, I don't see that it has, and it has definitely resulted in lower popularity for the government. I mean, Maduro there for a while was really, he had, like maybe half of the support that Chavez had. But I didn't see that it translated, in a huge increase, for the opposition. It very much seemed that, the majority of the population was still, they were more cynical and more resigned, but, that this isn't working, but not so, but not in the sense, that they would switch horses over to the opposition. And it seems, if anything, the U.S. and the opposition were very much aware of that. And especially the U.S. I mean, how this all started was that, the U.S. pressured the opposition very heavily, not to take part in the elections. They were thinking, if we can get, all the opposition candidates, to stay away from the presidential election, then we can, the turnout is going to be so low, we can declare these elections meaningless. But, I mean, that partly happened, but partly it didn't. One opposition guy, still ran. And look, the turnout was like 40% or something, but Maduro got, an overwhelming majority of that. So actually, he got more votes than Trump. I mean, he got, in America also, the turnout is 50%, and Trump got half of that. He got a quarter of the votes. For Maduro, it was a little over 1/3. I mean, it's nothing to write home about, but I don't really see, I don't see how he has less support. Like it does seem like even like the lower classes, they still kind of trust him more, than they trust America and the opposition. I mean, I don't know. I'm not there, but maybe they're rationalizing it, in the sense of, at least Maduro is on our side. At least these Bolivarian dudes are trying to help us, even though everything they seem to do seems to make it worse, But I mean, because their rhetoric is we're on the side of the poor, and nobody, is really believably saying that. What? I mean, Pompeo is believably saying, oh, children don't have medicine, really?
Yeah.
You know, but meanwhile, he's made it really hard for Venezuela, you know, to sell its oil, you know, so, and, you know, and he's crying crocodile tears about children and their medicine.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it's so obviously stupid on the face of it. Like, one of the things that I think most people know is one of the main Cuban exports is doctors. And so, you know, the fact that Pompeo is complaining about, you know, at the same time, Venezuelan children not having medical care, and then saying that Cuba needs to stop supporting Venezuela is really a head scratcher, because, you know, one of the main sources of support is the doctors. You also have, when the U.S., you know, says that, oh, the aid we're sending to Venezuela is the right aid, and then you have all these international aid organizations saying that we don't want to touch the aid because it's too politicized. And then you find out that, oh, wait, Venezuela is allowing like Russia and China to fly in aid because, hey, look, they understand that, you know, this aid definitely isn't going to have rifles hidden in it for the opposition, when the U.S. had just hired Elliot Abrams, who ran that operation back in the Reagan administration. Like, there's a real fear that something like that could happen. And yet, you know, nobody, unfortunately, you know, most people I talk to, even people who are a little bit more left wing and you would think have more sympathies with the communist government there, you know, just are like, nope, Maduro's a bad guy. He's bad to his own people. And I don't know, just it's so dangerous. That narrative. One other interesting thing going on in Venezuela, I'm not sure if you've been keeping up with this, Marco, but the Venezuelan embassy within the U.S., I think it's the one in D.C., the Venezuelan envoy was forced to go home by the Trump administration. And so then a bunch of Americans moved in there to make sure the opposition couldn't, and they did so with permission of the Venezuelan government. And now there's a bunch of opposition protesters outside. The police are only allowing a small portion of food inside, and there's been a couple arrests. So there's like this mini proxy battle going on in the streets of D.C. for the Venezuelan embassy. It's created quite the interesting situation. I'll link to an episode of the Scott Horton Show with Kevin Zeese, who I believe is inside the embassy, reporting on kind of what's going on there from their perspective.
First, I'd like to say, Kyle, I mean, that was just an awesome observation about the Cuban doctors. Yeah, I hadn't thought about it, but yeah, absolutely. You know, there's how many, like 20,000 doctors, something in Venezuela. You know, it's a big help. And, you know, the AIDS thing, actually in 2005, you know, Katrina down in New Orleans, actually Cuba and Nicaragua offered, you know, to help some help. Or I don't know if it was Nicaragua, maybe it was Venezuela. And Bush said, no, you know, like, we don't want your aid. And I mean, I don't think it would have been anything bad, you know, to take their aid, but they were kind of like, you know, no, we're not going to take your aid. You know, how dare you try to ingratiate yourself with us, you know, and make it harder for us to bomb you, you know, down the line. So, you know, Bush declined that, you know, and it wasn't a huge issue, you know, like.
Right. No, and people understood because it was Chavez at the time still, right? Had called Bush the Great Satan or something like that. And so, like, everybody kind of understood why Bush wouldn't want to take aid from that guy. Just like right now, if you're a Venezuelan and, you know, you are, you know, getting news, you probably read this study that says 40,000 people, the general mortality rate was strongly correlated to the U.S. sanctions being put in place on your country, died in the past year. So, you know what I mean? Like, I'm sure, like, they see the U.S. as the enemy and understand why their government is saying that, well, we're not taking aid from those people.
Yeah. And, you know, what you mentioned next, the embassy thing. Yeah, I listened to an interview with Kevin Zeese, is it? And he said, look, we're just doing what you know, America should be doing. You know, the government, you know, like, well, we're trying to prevent them, you know, doing for something illegal, you know, like, and yeah, you know, you can't just evict people, you know, like from their embassy. And, you know, it reminds me what happened at the UN, you know, with the UN ambassador, you know, telling the Venezuelan one, you know, you shouldn't be here. You know? So, I mean, they have so little self-awareness, you know, it's like, we don't like you, so you're not legitimate. You know, it really comes down to that. Because, you know, I was listening to Bolton the other day, and I think he's the worst, you know. I think well, I don't know, it's kind of tied between him and Pompeo. Like, he's saying, this is very obviously not a coup. We recognize Guaido as legitimate, so Okay, so that's what it makes it not a coup. You recognize him as legitimate, I mean, it's so Orwellian. And Bolton's been talking of the Monroe Doctrine, of all things, this, idea from 200 years ago, apparently it has some relevancy now. He's saying, oh, how dare the Russians intervene here? This is our hemisphere. And, Venezuela is going to have its destiny decided by people from this hemisphere. And it's like, oh really? So I guess it's like a collective choice, of everybody in the Western hemisphere, what goes in Venezuela. It's not just theirs, but I don't know, does it work two ways? Do the Venezuelans get to say, then who rules in Washington? And I mean, about the Monroe Doctrine, even if we're going to be talking that up, it's the very first thing that Monroe Doctrine said was look, America is not going to be intervening in European affairs, as a quid pro quo. So what are we talking about here? And look, on the lack of self-awareness, do you imagine, Russia's Sergei Lavrov, saying, how dares America be in Estonia? This violates the Brezhnev Doctrine. I mean, he'd be laughed, he'd be laughed at, but for some reason, it doesn't happen with Bolton, except with us.
Right. Well, I mean, there's a few of us that do look at it and laugh, and we realize just how ridiculous and stupid it is. But it's not like something that's covered and discussed enough for people really to understand how stupid it is. And they remember the Monroe Doctrine from history class. And, it seemed like a pretty, gung-ho, yay, America time in history. So, why not have that again? But while we're talking about the Monroe Doctrine, and, I guess you probably have a similar interpretation to me here, that this regime change effort really doesn't seem to be going anywhere fast, that this is, really, I think, a blow to what the U.S. empire is able to achieve. And, it's kind of showing on a world stage that, hey, if Russia says no to something, then that no kind of plays out. And, more countries may be interested in becoming closer to Russia to get out of the U.S. orbit. We saw this in Syria, where Russia was able to step in and save the Assad regime. And I don't know if, Maduro would have been overthrown without the support of Russia here, but Russia has certainly stepped up and said it's not going to happen, and, has put their troops and deployed bombers to the country a couple times to signal their allegiance with the country. I'm sure that these are big things that play internationally. And I don't know, I think it is just a very interesting discussion to have about geopolitics and what's happening to the standing of the U.S. empire, as Trump, I think, again, is showing our inability to, do kind of what we are doing after the fall of the Soviet Union, which is intervening anywhere and doing what we wanted.
Yeah, and I don't think it's it's really because of Russia is so effective or so powerful or anything like that. It's really because of incompetence, on the U.S. part, and Russia is just kind of taking advantage of that, and yeah, it is a boost, for sure. To countries like that, to have somebody like Russia on their side, even if it's just a morale boost, because, I do remember, the 1990s were at that very different place in that respect. When Yeltsin was going along with, American, imperialism, it was really much more lonely, for countries like Yugoslavia at the time and in Iraq and so on.
Well, maybe this is a good chance to switch over to Syria, which is something that I've neglected a little bit on the show recently. And Marco, I know you've been covering over at Checkpoint Asia, so I'll let you go ahead and kind of just fill in on what's been happening.
Yeah, well, I mean, fill in that would take weeks, but I mean, a very new development is the fuel crisis, So throughout the war, Syria kind of had enough fuel, even though, before the war, they weren't a major oil exporter, but they produced enough for themselves and little for export. And, but then those oil fields got taken over by ISIS. I mean, actually, when the oil fields got taken over, it was ISIS and the rebels working together. They were still together. The inter-rebel civil war had not happened yet. But yeah, anyway, ISIS more or less destroyed those oil fields as they were retreating, and actually even before that, the Americans and Russians bombed the hell out of them. So the production there is very low right now. Plus, most of them are actually held by the Kurds, by the US-backed Kurds. So actually, how Syria was getting by, through the war was Iran was sending its oil, and Iran. It's the thing with Iran is it could produce a lot more than it does, but it just doesn't have clients to sell to, and that is because of the U.S. pressure now, which is increased exponentially under Trump, and especially in the last year, Trump is now actually saying, he's going to sanction China, India, and Turkey if they don't stop buying Iranian oil, and those are the last three remaining clients. So, and somehow Syria fell victim of that, like the Iranian shipments stopped. And actually, I'm trying to research this, and I cannot find a definite answer. But so far, maybe it's a mix of things. It's like, Iran is under such fiscal pressure that it seems, they said to the Syrians, look, we can continue, like shipping you this oil on credit, but you got to pay us, start paying us, at least a little bit, like. It's understandable, they need at least some money, to keep the production going. And, but it's more than that. It's also like, America has really been identifying, the companies, that ship this oil. And then, pressuring insurance companies, to stop covering, these companies. And that sort of thing. And there was even talk, that they pressured Egypt, to prevent the tankers, from coming through the Suez, because there is a tanker that's been stranded there, for 4 months now. But I don't think if that's really true, because apparently, like legally, Egypt couldn't block the Suez, even if they could, just because it has the status of an international waterway. In any case, so in Syria right now, you have, this huge fuel lines, people can wait, entire day, or 2 days, to get some fuel in their car, even though it's all rationed, they can just buy like 20 liters every 5 days or something like that. So, it's really interesting, because if America was able to impose such a fuel crisis, a few years before, it would have actually probably affected, the military operations of the Syrian army. So, it's kind of a lost opportunity for the empire there, but, not one we're going to mourn. I don't think so. So, and meanwhile, you've got Pentagon, there's this question of, is America actually going to get out of eastern Syria or not? Because Trump was saying, yeah, we're doing that. That's part of the things that I said as candidates. And, Pentagon kind of said, no, that's not really happening, and, they asked Pentagon again, what's up with that? And actually the reply was, hey, you know what? We're actually really comfortable, sitting here in eastern Syria. And in particularly because it got lots of oil, so I don't know, I thought you're not actually supposed to say things like that, that's actually supposed to kind of be kind of hush hush, but here we go. But, So you've got American troops, sitting on Syria's oil, as America imposes an oil blockade on Syria, which is a fun concept. But no, there's only like 2,000 or maybe by now even just 1,000 American troops there, so they're not able to block anything themselves. How they get it done is the Kurdish militias, do it for them. But the Kurds there are locals, so I think the Kurds are making like, they want to be seen as cooperating, but I think a lot of that oil, still ends up, across the river on the Syrian side, on the government controlled side. because I don't know. I mean, in this sort of wars, which are, civil wars and very fictitious, this sort of commerce never stops. It was the same in our end, in the Balkans. And really, I mean, even when ISIS was holding that, some of that oil still went, to government areas. So I don't believe for a moment that has stopped. But nonetheless, it's just not enough. And like, I don't know, like we mentioned Russia before, I read a few commentators who are like, hey, doesn't Russia have tons and tons of oil? Like, why aren't they sending, why didn't they just make up, for the Iranian shipments? And, they did help a little bit, but, I don't have an answer to that, like maybe Russia doesn't want to do it, just because, it would be, Russia isn't particularly wealthy, so it could become a domestic issue, like why are we giving, away our oil for free, if we can, if it's oil that we can, sell on the market and actually get money for.
Right. Well, I know Russia, I think, is producing well over 1 million barrels of oil today now, maybe like 5 million. So they're a major oil producer. I don't know. I know the Assad regime is pretty heavily sanctioned, so it could have something to do with that. Russia not wanting to incur the wrath of the secondary sanctions from the U.S., which you point out there is a big deal, or possibly a big deal with the, reason that Iran isn't bringing as much, oil to Syria right now, and that, Egypt is not, doing business with these tankers possibly because of the, sanctions against Assad and Iran. So it could be a sanctions issue there. Have you been tracking what's going on in the Idlib province at all with, Russia and Syria possibly, carrying off that attack and finishing off that Al-Qaeda enclave out there? Or are they just still, kind of sitting there, and why the U.S. and Turkey are preventing an attack from going forward?
Well, right now it's like everybody's saying the offensive is happening. Like the rumor mill, that's what it's saying. And actually, that's also, kind of like information trickling out, in the sense that there is definitely a troop buildup, and there's way more bombing than there used to be by the Syrian and Russian Air Force, for like 10 days or so. And even, civilians have started to get out of it. So it's like everybody expects this to happen. But I mean, things like that happened before, like everybody's expecting an offensive, and then it doesn't happen. But before offensive happens, this is how it looks like, so, don't be surprised, if it goes off. But, the last time there was like a really huge buildup was, in mid 2018. And, it was funny at the time because, actually, the U.S. was starting to say things like, hey, like there better not be a lot of, civilian casualties in this, and Trump was tweeting things like that. So it's, they were warning against the offensive, which is, it's interesting in the context that Trump did stop the aid to rebels, but by now, he was a factor in stopping what could have been perhaps the final Syrian offensive against them. Albeit at the time Turkey and Erdogan really played a much bigger part. To me it was very clear that what had happened was that Erdogan intervened with Putin and explained to him that this is really important to him. That this does not happen. So kind of Putin gave Erdogan another chance. To reign in Al-Qaeda. Which is really the most powerful faction, in Idlib among the rebel factions by far. But it still didn't happen, like just the other week there was an Al-Qaeda attack, across the front lines, that killed 22 Syrian army soldiers. So, because what you have there is, the Turkish military is actually, has positioned, itself, in between the Syrian army and the Islamist rebels. But, the Turkish presence there is enough to keep the Syrians from attacking. But apparently it's not enough, to keep Al-Qaeda from attacking, in the other direction. So it's not a great situation for the Syrians. Albeit, like I don't know, like the Islamists, the Al-Qaeda, they would probably say, well, the Turks aren't stopping, the Syrians attacking us from the air, so I guess there's that.
Yeah, well, we saw this, I think, most clearly with Aleppo and Douma, where, every time Assad and Russia start bombing somewhere, the U.S., mostly through their kind of like proxy media propaganda organization, the White Helmets, were saying, oh, they're killing women and civilians and children, and oh, look how brutal and terrible Assad is. U.S., please use your bombs to save our lives. And of course, at, those times, the U.S. was absolutely wrecking Mosul and Raqqa and Ramadi and all these other, cities with our bombs. But yet, when they did it, it was a huge crisis. So that one of my concerns is that is this is going to be another like, oh my God, look what a terrible butcher Assad and Russia are. And oh, right after, Putin, stole the election. Now look what he's at to again. And at the same time, they're going to be talking about how 2020 and the new Russiagate buildup, it just really demonizing Putin as a part of this. So I don't know. I guess maybe there's a chance they could manage this like they did southern Syria, where they were able to cut a lot of deals around the Dara area with all the different rebel groups. But from my understanding, there's a lot of Uyghurs here, and these are jihadists from China who are, I guess, kind of stuck. China's not going to take them back. They really, if they're ISIS, so if they surrender to Assad, it's probably a pretty cruel and horrible fate. And there's really nowhere for them to go but to fight. And I don't know. So maybe they end up having to fight this out, and it gets pretty nasty. I don't know. Are you concerned with, this whole propaganda push that Assad's a butcher?
Well, I mean, you're right about that. That many of these rebel enclaves, many of them just folded peacefully before, but Idlib is the last remaining one. Because the selling point before was always, look, why don't you just fold peacefully and you can even we'll even let you keep your rifles and you just transfer over to Idlib, where the rest of your friends are, So so that was always an option, for the diehards. They didn't have to go back to living under Assad. They could just transfer to the main rebel territory, but that option, doesn't exist anymore. So, there's no left to go, backs are to the wall, If they lose this, they don't have their Islamic Emirates anymore, and like you said, a lot of them are foreigners, where they, it's not going to be a welcome wagon for them, when they return back home, Uyghurs are probably in the worst position in that sense, yeah. And yeah, what you said about the demonization, yeah, I mean, it's really interesting, right? It's like Assad has to be, damn, when can I attack Al-Qaeda? I have to do it, when the U.S. is not looking, because otherwise they're gonna, they're gonna demonize me and, maybe come, to their help. It's like, what kind of world are we living in? It's like, other countries are not allowed to attack Al-Qaeda because, America might intervene, against them. It's truly bizarre. And yeah, we were talking before, about civilian casualties, and it's like, for sure, Assad had all the artillery, right? And, if he has all the artillery, he's going to use it, and invariably, civilians are going to get killed as well. But there was this new study that said 1,600 people, civilians, were killed in Raqqa, when America was trying to take it, and the U.S. backed Kurds. And, the 1,600 civilians killed there in Raqqa, I read an article that, the track down, the civilian casualties also, claimed by the pro-opposition outlets. So, which have an incentive probably to exaggerate, victims caused by the civilians, but don't really have the incentive to exaggerate casualties by Americans, since they're hoping for American intervention on their side. Also said, 1,600 civilians also happened in Aleppo, but the time frame was different. The time frame in Aleppo was 4 times, longer. So it's like, according to proposition outlets, Americans and the Kurds, but I mean, it was American firepower, the bombs and the artillery, was killing civilians in Raqqa at 4 times the rate that Assad and the Russians were killing in Aleppo. So, and I mean, one civilian victim is too much, but it speaks to the hypocrisy. And like actually in this whole thing about in the way American way of war in eastern Syria, like was it a month ago or 2 months ago? 2 months ago, under a French colonel, who, aside from the 2,000 Americans, there was also about 200 French assisting the Kurds in eastern Syria. He actually wrote an article for Foreign Policy, and he absolutely blasted, American tactics. He said, look, this is not a soldierly way to fight. I mean, all we're doing, is just transferring all the, cost of the fighting onto the civilians. We are afraid to lose or to risk, a single one of our guys, and then, 10 civilians have to pay for that. I mean, look, this is the gist of his message, right? But, this is what, it's what he said. And I don't know. I think that's really it's kind of almost like, but it happens because, the Washington DC feels it cannot have wars otherwise. It feels like, if Americans start coming back in body bags, it cannot have these wars. It's not like, that they mind, like some American soldiers getting killed, but I think the political cost is too much, and then, the civilians, the locals, get to pay the price tenfold, and it really goes a lot. This thing really goes back a long way. I mean, Jesus Christ! Like 20 years ago, when they were bombing Yugoslavia, they didn't want to come down under 5,000 feet, because they were like, if a single one of our airplanes gets shot down, it's gonna be, it's gonna be a huge question, for us domestically. Why are we fighting over there? What does that have to do with anything? And wanting to avoid that, they didn't want to come down to low altitudes, but that also meant they were totally ineffective, against the Yugoslav army, because, the Yugoslav army wasn't trying to attack anybody, they would just dig in and dispersed all around the place and, camouflaged and in forests and on top of hills and stuff like that. So there's no way to hurt them. So they did the other thing, they went after civilian infrastructure, and tried to terrorize civilians. So, it's just something that happens over and over again, I mean, it's like, Americans, as a people are not warlike and stuff like that, and, not really to blame, for all these wars, but it's almost like, in some ways it might have actually been better, if Americans were more militaristic, or if Washington thought they were, because, if Washington thought, look, it doesn't matter, if you lose some of our people, but we actually do save, more civilians, like we're saying we want to.
Well, yeah, no, I mean, there's some perfect examples of this too, where in Vietnam you had so many Americans dying because they were the ones, doing the fighting, that the anti-war movement was able to end it. When you look at the Iraq war, eventually you had so many Americans coming back in body bags. There was no way that George Bush was gonna, be able to hand that war off to a Republican president. And so, essentially that war, I think, ends up winding down a little bit because, of the anti-war movement. And even now, you could look to a situation like Niger, where no American would have ever cared what the hell American policy was towards Niger. We could have had 3,000 troops deployed to that country. Nobody would have cared until those 4 Americans died. And then it was a big deal. Even then, I mean, they've kind of gotten away with keeping their true presence in Africa, and nobody really demanded any kind of policy change. I think we do see through American foreign policy right now that Americans will tolerate, I don't know, a few dozen American troop deaths a year. I guess we're going to probably end up with about 20 again in Afghanistan. assuming the current pace, maybe a dozen out of Iraq and Syria, and then I don't know, maybe a couple more special operation deaths around the world. And that's going to be something that people are just going to be able to be like, oh, our Americans are heroes and great, and they're, doing all the things to protect us from terrorists and keep us safe, and brush that off. But if, you did have a major U.S. operation, let's say it was American troops that were fighting ISIS, and so it wasn't the Iraqi army that was walking into the ambushes, or it wasn't the Syrian Kurds that were tripping ISIS, booby traps and getting killed, or, just the more indiscriminate bombing type campaign where rather than anybody possibly getting hit by ISIS sniper fire, we just destroy a whole apartment building. Maybe there's 50 innocent civilians in there and 10 snipers, but that's the calculation we made to keep the deaths from our troops and our allies down. That's the decision that ends up happening rather than, trying to go clear the building and save the people. Like, I think Americans imagine their heroic special operation teams. That's kind of what we think they actually do. They go in there with their, guns and kind of like Osama bin Laden style raid, just go through and kill all the bad guys. But that certainly isn't the case of definitely what's happened in the fight against ISIS and in general, our wars in the Middle East right now. And I've even seen some people who, and I don't agree with this, policy at all, but saying that we need to reinstitute the draft. At least then, more Americans will have their kind of some skin in the game. And even if the death totals are low, what I mean? Like, every family in America risk, sending one of their young men to be kind of the tribute and pay the blood price for fighting these foreign wars every year. And maybe even if that risk is, 0.001%, the fact that there is some randomness to it and it could be anyone, could help to turn kind of public opinion against the wars.
For sure. I mean, it would kind of force people, to think more about, are these wars actually worth fighting? And, the answer would mainly be no.
Yeah. And, I certainly do think that's, a popular public opinion in the U.S., especially when you look at how elections end up going for president. Obama was the peace candidate in both of his elections. I think you got to put those peace in air quotes pretty much. Trump was as well. I mean, Hillary Clinton was the ultimate hawk who was responsible for a lot of the wars the U.S. is still in. And Donald Trump was, calling for some kind of, let's slow this down a little bit. Not that you could really call him a peace candidate, but of the two of them, he was more peaceful than the absolute war hawk. And so I do think that's popular, especially among people who, Ohio, where there's a lot of veterans, and in the southern states where there's a lot of veterans, a lot of people who either know somebody whose life has been ruined because of the war, PTSD, abuse problems, whether it's domestic, drugs, sexual, that's just ruining lives, or people who just died directly from combat, lost legs, stuff like that. Everybody kind of knows somebody in certain areas of the country like that, and I think that has a bigger impact, on the votes in those states especially.
And when you don't have enough of your own troops, what that leads America to is compromises where it places its support behind people like Al Qaeda, which is like insane and crazy. But yeah, I mean, if you don't want to send, your own troops there, to fight Assad, you gotta back whoever is already doing it, and people who are most effective at it were Al Qaeda. So, you end up shutting your eye to that. And look, as much as I detest, American imperialism, American occupation, if they really do it right, where they pour in enough troops that they feel secured, and they're not in constant panic and fear of their life, it's bad, but it's not as bad as occupation by Al Qaeda. And yet, that is what they were imposing on, look, and there's, in Syria, you've got Alawites and Christians and Shia, and Al Qaeda was taking over their villages, and what happens when they do that, it's enslavement and forced conversion. And if you're really happy, they will just evict you or force you to pay, high taxes and follow the Sharia law, like you cannot drink alcohol anymore. If you're really, really lucky, you're imposing that on the world, like on people living their lives there because you're so idealistic, you cannot stand, Assad in power, he's a little bit too evil for your taste. Like, and then you go back Al Qaeda, like, I don't know, crazy.
No, I mean, what's a better example right now than Yemen, where the U.S. absolutely can't commit troops there because there's enough public pressure to at least say that we're not allowed to be in that kind of ground war in Yemen. Saudi Arabia can't, get any Yemenis to fight there without paying them, and I guess Sudan can't turn up with enough mercenaries. So now they're backing Al Qaeda and ISIS in Yemen, and that's a large part of the U.S., Saudi, UAE backed forces in that country. And it's because, the American people would obviously reject it if we tried to put Americans to fight the Houthis. And yet we kind of just let our proxy forces do it and Al Qaeda do it, and then nobody cares. So that's quite the amazing thing that goes on, and that's a great observation.
Yeah, and how come these people don't realize? Look, Zaydis, they're technically Shia, and Shia by Wahhabi Salafist doctrine, followed by Al Qaeda and ISIS, are apostates from Islam. They're no longer because they used to be Muslim, but now being Shia, they're no longer Muslim, and penalty for that, according to Salafists, is death. So, when Al Qaeda takes, if Al Qaeda takes over a Shia village, they consider themselves extremely merciful and, huge humanitarians if they don't just, round up everybody, and just shoot them,
Right. And we've seen ISIS carry out those kind of acts, especially in Iraq and Syria. Well, we're getting close to an hour here, so maybe we should wrap this up. I know we had something about the S-35, but we leave that off. I think this was a great conversation. Syria and Venezuela, two of the real interesting kind of proxy flare-up spots for this new great power struggle between the U.S. and Russia. And all the just little interesting details and things going on, how stupid the U.S. policy is here, how much it actually harms the American people and, and everybody everywhere else too. So I don't know, Marko, go ahead and let people know what's going on at Checkpoint Asia, what kind of projects you got coming up, and hopefully I'll have you back on the show again to do another one of these kind of discussions here.
I'm publishing a news site, Checkpoint Asia, and on the one in one way, it's just one more alternative media website there, sort of Empire Watch is a lot of what I do. But, in the sense it's a little bit different is that, I also worry about, the mental sanity of us, who do this, who are following Empire all the time. And, that means, that, when Empire suffers a setback, I do a happy dance, so in that sense, I'm different from a lot of the, other websites, like, for example, antiwar.com, I love it, I really love it, it's been my top site for nearly 20 years now. And, what they do is so necessary and, the approach they have is perfect for what they want to do, it's like they want to try and limit the wars, as best they can, get as many Americans, to care about the wars, to see the evil of them and to pick up the phone and call their congressman and said, hey, why don't you do something about this? And for that, they have the perfect narrative voice. But, I'm not an American. I don't want to just speak to Americans. So my approach is a little bit different, if wars are limited, because America, partly reforms itself, there's more people, who are anti-war and are calling the congressmen. That's great, But, if the empire launches less wars, because it got badly beaten, in the previous one, or because, I don't know, China is more powerful now and, they can just, interfere in Asia as freely as they did before, I celebrate that as well, I will, at this point, I will take anything I can, anything that that limits this, unilateral hegemony of the U.S., I will take it.
Well, I guess luckily for you, Trump has put Bolton and Pompeo in his administration, so there's plenty of good content of the Trump administration and his guys doing something.
I mean, if you follow the U.S., the U.S. is so powerful. I mean, militarily especially, but they just keep doing a blunder after blunder, and in the sense that these blunders, cost people's lives, it's a tragedy, but in the sense that they will gradually diminish American power and, it's just its fiscal health and will eventually, cause the empire to collapse or maybe to retrench, in that sense, it's a good thing, you gotta look at the positives, it's the only way to, to still, keep smiling.
All right. Thanks for coming back on the show.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks so much for tuning in today's show. Remember, the most important thing you could do is to share the show somewhere, find it online at the Libertarian Institute, and then subscribe to the show on one of the podcatchers and give it a rating and review if you haven't already. Thank you.